Well, welcome to Benchmark Books. I'm Kurt Bench, the owner and chief Bill Pear. But I see some faces I don't recognize. That's always good. I'm curious, how many have not been to our bookstore before? Okay. And did anybody come as a result of the newspaper announcement? Yeah. Good. Well, once you're my captive audience, you kind of have to listen to what I have to say. So I get to be shamelessly self-promoting. Just to tell you a little bit about Benchmark Books, for those of you who aren't familiar with us. I like to be compared to an oasis in the desert. Somebody has made that comparison. We try to have real books for real people that like to study, like to read deeply, and if you don't, we have novels too. But we tend to emphasize here some of the harder to find books, and whether it be church history or doctrine. And I'm very picky about who I like to come and speak at an author signing. I usually like to have the author of the book, for one thing. But a lot of authors ask if we will, feature them at a signing at our store, and I really don't do it that often. I have to be personally impressed by the book and the author, and I don't know Charlie well enough to use that as a segue into something funny, but I was very impressed with reading Charlie Harrell's book. His publisher, Greg Coford, would you like to stand, Greg? It's Greg Coford of Greg Coford Books. There's really no confusion there. He is publishing some wonderful books, and this one is one of the nicest looking books that you've done, Greg. I'm really impressed with the craftsmanship and the design. The only complaint I have is I just don't think that looks like Charlie at all on the cover. Because you wouldn't be able to have a beard at BYU. That's
another 20 years.
Yeah. But it's not only a fine looking book, and I'm going to tell you a little bit, but not much. But it is a book that's well worth reading, and I think that come on in. Just sidle down there on the side. We've still got chairs, haven't we?
Yeah, there's some over here.
Okay, and there's some on the far aisle if you want to go over there. I can't remember where I was. What was I talking about? Something about this book. I love the craftsmanship. I was going to tell you that there's a good news and bad news story here tonight. Good news is an LDS bishop canceled the bishopric meeting to be here. The bad news is it's Charlie's bishop. It isn't really, but we welcome the bishop who will remain anonymous. But he is one that I think represents this group in that I don't think you'd be here unless you like to read and you like to study serious church history and doctrine and so on. And I was very impressed with Charlie's book. I got an advanced reading copy some time ago, and I've been reading it ever since I got it. And I love the title page, and I'm sure the rest is good too. I'm a slow reader. No, I've got like one chapter left, but I think it's well worth a serious look from anyone who is interested in those things that I was mentioning. I need to mention a couple of things that are just sort of housekeeping types of things. If you are not currently on our email list, if you wouldn't mind signing up on this, we would love to put you on our list to let you know about events like this. And sales that we have, we'll be having our fall sale very soon. And occasionally we put together a list of new books that have come out, as well as sale books. And if any of you are also interested in collecting rare Mormon books, we do that as well. And once in a while we put out a rare book catalog. So if you're serious about collecting as well as just reading, you could let us know that, and we'll put you on that list. But we hope that you'll become a fan of Benchmark books and the types of books that we like to promote here. I was doing some housekeeping. We have that doesn't go in the transcript, the code to get into the bathrooms down the hall by the drinking fountain. If you should have a need, you can just punch in those 3 numbers that are posted on the door. And we will have some refreshments afterward, and we'd love for you to stick around, talk to Charlie and have him sign your book. We'd like you to do is when you, after he speaks, and we're going to save some time for questions and answers, so I hope you're thinking about things you want to ask him. Then we just have you come up and purchase your books, and he'll be sitting at the table here, and we'll sign them for you. And so we'll do that after we're done. We'll try to bring the program itself to a close by 7 o'clock. Any questions on procedure or anything at this point? I'm just going to make my actual introduction of Charlie very brief, but he is an associate professor at Brigham Young University, and hopefully for the foreseeable future. That's supposed to be a joke. He is in the, is it School of Technology? He has published a number of articles in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, BYU Studies, I believe, and also the series Studies in Scripture, and perhaps elsewhere. I think that he has created here some groundbreaking work, and I don't know, I'm just curious, how many of you have had a chance to read some or all of his book? That's good. And I hope all the rest of you will do so very soon. I think it's very thought-provoking, and he's done his homework, believe me. He's been working on this for several years, and I'm going to just let him tell us about the book now, and then save up your questions, and we'll ask those, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much for coming.
Good evening. See if I have a voice. When you teach, you tend to talk a lot, and then you lose your voice during the day, and you don't have much left in the evening. I appreciate Kurt inviting me here to present and talk about the book, and appreciate all of you being here to listen to it, and look forward to the questions that you have to ask, and hopefully I can give some response, even if it may not be the response that you would maybe like to hear or like to have. Just a little background on myself. I grew up in Indiana in the mission field. My family were converts to the church when I was 5 years old, so I grew up wondering about why, our family was the only family in town virtually that was members of the church. So that gave me a lot of curiosity into the church and Mormonism, wondering what is it that we believe that differentiates us from other religions, that makes us unique, and why should I be different than everybody else, and refrain from the habits that a lot of my friends and peers had. But as I came out to BYU, went to school, I had a real insatiable appetite for doctrine for some reason. I guess I have a double cursing. I'm cursed with being an engineer. They always talk about engineers as being the geeks, but I'm also kind of a doctrinal geek, and so I'm just geekish. But as a result of that, I cut my teeth on Bruce R. McConkie, Joseph Fielding Smith. I was very conservative in my views and my beliefs. Wanted to learn what the doctrine was, what the church actually taught. And I went back to the early writings of Joseph Smith, the other prophets, and started with history of the church, went through journal of discourses, everything, because I wanted to know it all. I just had that kind of an appetite. And I was of the mind that it was all consistent too, that all teachings were congruent, all teachings today are congruent with the teachings of the past, and that the same truths that are taught today are the same truths that were taught in Joseph Smith's day, at the time of Christ, the time of Adam. But the more I got into reading the scriptures, reading the writings of prophets, sermons, I discovered that there was a lot of disparity. And the more I found the disparity, the more I still tried to reconcile everything, and it became more and more challenging until I came to a realization that if you line up the teachings chronologically, all of a sudden everything starts to make sense. Doctrine has a history. And that was, to me, one of those aha moments. And I started looking at everything that I had learned and sorting it out chronologically, historically. And the stories, to me, were just very fascinating. I had done an article in BYU Studies back in the 80s on the development of the doctrine of pre-existence. That was one of the first attempts to outline historically what this development was. And I came to the conclusion, or to the discovery, that this doctrine went through at least 4 stages of development during the lifetime of Joseph Smith, none of which was completely congruent with the other, and all of which had precedent in the religious environs of Joseph Smith. And so that kind of led me to inquire as to, well, if doctrine has a history, it's not always consistent or uniform, what's the cause of that? And the conclusion I came to, after much study and investigation, was that there are cultural influences at work here. Now, it's hard to say why there are doctrinal differences, because you have to get into almost the nature of revelation itself, get into the mind of the prophets, get into the mind of God. So, I'm not ruling out any possibility, but it just seems to me, as I've looked at historically the teachings of the time, and as the Old Testament was being written, as the New Testament was being developed, as early Mormon scripture came about, there's a remarkable, striking similarity between the teachings that were being presented and those in the immediate culture. So that's kind of what got me on to writing the book. Let's see, those of you who have looked at it, basically the outline of it. There's a preface that talks about kind of the philosophy behind the book, why I was writing it. I should mention that I had to struggle with several decisions. One was, for example, the scope. I wanted this to be a comprehensive book to kind of touch on all the significant Mormon doctrines. Now, that's kind of an ambitious initiative, because obviously there's a lot of doctrines and there's a lot written about all these doctrines. And then I also wanted to not just trace the historical development from the time of Joseph Smith. In other words, not just the development within Mormonism, but I thought most readers would be interested in knowing, well, now that we know how it developed in Mormonism, what was the original intent behind these scriptural passages that we base so much of our Mormon theology on? So I went back, scoured the Old Testament, New Testament writings, commentaries, and came up with what appealed to me, at least, as being thoughtful, intelligent commentaries and explanations of these passages that we, for so many years, tend to just assume that they all support the Mormon perspective and Mormon doctrine. So that's something that I'm sure some people will probably disagree with, and feel like, well, you were selective in your sources in interpreting these passages, and so be it. They just happen to be the sources that, to me, made the most sense and gave the most compelling explanation. The other decision I had to make was, this is a book written largely to a Mormon audience, LDS audience. Do I try to be apologetic? Do I try to be adversarial and slam Mormon doctrine? I've tried to take a stance that was neutral and tried to just tell the story of the development as much as I could. But even at that, I'm sure there will be, the conservative factor that will say, well, you went too far. And I've already seen some feedback too that says from the anti-Mormon faction that says you didn't go far enough.
You got her just right.
Yeah, so hopefully it's a Goldilocks sort of book that way, doing it just right. But that was my intent. The chapters are divided up so that the initial chapters first chapter talks about theology, just the nature of theology in general, and the fact that it seems to be a divine human enterprise. People do theology. God reveals truths. I'm all in favor of that and supportive of that, but there's so much that gets filtered through human understanding, cultural influences that have had an impact on humans, so that the result is something that is very similar to the cultural understanding of the people at the time. After chapter 1, I dive pretty heavily right into the core doctrines, in fact, the fundamental doctrines of Mormonism, which is the apostasy and the restoration. When you take that away, there is no Mormonism. It's all based on the fact that there was an apostasy, that there was a restoration. What I've come to the conclusion to is that there are narratives that have developed within Mormonism over time, and many of these narratives have been influenced and perhaps even borrowed from the Reformation, from restorationist movements at the time of Joseph Smith. There were already movements who were taking these same passages that we use in Mormonism to defend or to support the idea of an apostasy, of a restoration. That was already being done. There were several movements who claimed to be the restoration of the ancient order of things. So, again, this isn't to say that there was no apostasy, that there was no restoration, but I think we need to reconsider the narratives on which these doctrines, these ideas are based, and rethink them. It's interesting to me that we haven't had a big problem rethinking narratives about the American Indian, the Lamanite sort of connection. We thought that and said, well, everything's still okay. We just have a different story now, a different narrative way of explaining that. Same thing is becoming true with evolution. This is a huge movement going on in the world today, and it has been for decades, centuries, since Charles Darwin. And now how do we explain the accounts of the creation? Well, we haven't had much difficulty in Mormonism just retelling, reinterpreting, reformulating the story so that, okay, there was still a creation in some sense that God was involved in. There was still, in some sense, a fall, even though that really doesn't fit into an evolutionist sort of a worldview. And so, given that, we still maintain kind of the fabric of our religion, of Christianity, and of theism. So after talking about the apostasy, the restoration, I launch into some of the standard doctrines about the Godhead, talk about God the Father, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, how those individuals relate to each other, and how they each individually were perceived in Old Testament times, New Testament times, and then early 19th century evangelicalism, which is what I call it, which is really kind of the thought and the discourse that was taking place during the time of the Second Great Awakening. I should mention that was one of the other challenges I had. When you start taking the whole history, you got to leave gaps. I mean, you got to skip over periods. And I know there will be some people who will say, well, gosh, you should have talked about all the councils, the creedal councils, and how doctrines got shaped during those periods. So basically, I jump ahead from New Testament Christianity up to the time of the Second Great Awakening and the mindset, the religious mindset at that time. So for me, those different perspectives of the members of the Godhead as well as the Godhead collectively have been very fascinating because they're really different, quite different from the Old Testament to the New Testament to early Mormonism and then even into later Mormonism. Our perceptions, our understanding, the way that we have interpreted the scriptures regarding these individuals has changed. After talking about the Godhead, then I go into some of the more primeval doctrines of the creation, pre-existence, the fall, and then we start into the plan of salvation where I talk about the atonement, the gospel plan, the priesthood, salvation for the dead, and then I shift to more eschatological end-time sorts of issues such as the millennium, the second coming, the resurrection, final judgment. So it's really a pretty comprehensive sweep of the set of Mormon doctrines. And then at the end, there's an epilogue. Those of you who've gone through it, I know some of you said that you wanted to jump ahead to see what I make of all this stuff. And there I talk about the fact that we probably do need to rethink some of our narratives, and we need to think about some of the justification that we give. And we're so anxious to find scriptural support, biblical support for all of our teachings, when in fact maybe that isn't the most desirable and certainly not the first or primary source of support for the doctrines that we teach, because these doctrines have been different in different periods, and we live in a different time, different place, new paradigms, and the thinking is different. So that's kind of a brief overview of the book. How much time did I take, Kurt?
Well, you've got plenty. It's about
Plenty of
20 after.
additional time?
So.
Okay. Maybe I could share a couple of interesting discoveries to me as I went through the book. One area that I found fascinating was in looking at the restoration was Peter's restoration of all things in Acts. And as you look at, and this is a good sample of the kind of development that is discussed throughout the book on a number of different topics. As you look in the Old Testament, where it teaches things or talks about restoration, it's almost exclusively focused on the restoration of Israel. Israel was taken into captivity. The Old Testament prophets were anxious to get Israel restored and to preach to the people that you need to repent. God has great promises in store for you. He's going to restore Israel again to its ancient glory and even to a glory that exceeds what it was in the past. To even incorporate the blessings, the kind of atmosphere that existed during the Garden of Eden. Now, as we read Old Testament prophecies about this restoration, we read a millennium into that and say, oh, they were prophesying of the millennium. But as I read the Old Testament, and Old Testament commentaries and Old Testament scholarship tends to corroborate this, is that what they viewed was an end-time state of affairs in the world, not a millennial period followed later by a final judgment, but that the final judgment would usher in this final period of the earth, and that was it. So this is the sort of restoration that is spoken of in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, in Acts chapter 3, where Peter talks about the restitution of all things spoken of by all the holy prophets since the world began. Kind of an interesting way to describe it. And yet, all the holy prophets since the world began, what kind of restoration did they talk about? Was it a restoration of the gospel, of the church? While Peter quotes Moses as one of those prophets. In Deuteronomy, the passage about a prophet shall the Lord raise up like unto Moses, and the people need to pay heed to this prophet or they'll be cut off, sort of thing. And Peter says, okay, this prophecy has been fulfilled in the raising up of Jesus Christ, who came to turn everyone from his sins. Okay, so the kind of restoration turns into sort of a spiritual restoration, a restoration from sin, from the ravages of sin. And this is how most Bible commentators, New Testament scholars, understand the restoration of all things. That is, in fact, how it was understood at the time of Joseph Smith, and that's how it was understood in early Mormonism. That was the restoration that early Mormons understood from Peter's restoration of all things. Now, in the Book of Mormon, we read about a restoration of all things, but it's in a completely different context. It has to do with, remember, the body being restored to the spirit and body, and it doesn't mean that the wicked are going to be restored to happiness, but that the wickedness are going to be restored to what they actually deserve, which is misery. And so you wonder, well, that's something else totally different. Well, it turns out that at the time of Joseph Smith, there was a great debate between Universalists and evangelicals on the meaning of Peter's restitution or restoration of all things. And Universalists said, well, Peter said that it's a restitution of all things. How can it be a restitution of all things if it doesn't include the wicked as well? And evangelicals said, well, it just doesn't include the wicked, it only includes the righteous. And so they had to come up with ways to explain that and how to get around this all things phrase. And the way they did it is, one of the ways that they did it, that I quote, which is in a Congregationalist magazine at the time in 1805. In fact, I'm going to read that because it's kind of interesting. So on page 62. An article published in September 1805 in the Connecticut Evangelical Magazine explained that, quote, the restitution of all things which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets is an event contemporary with judgment, and may be understood to mean that things will all then be restored to order, and every creature will have his proper place assigned to him. The righteous will be admitted to heaven, while the wicked will be left in a state of impenitence and wrath. So it gives essentially the same explanation that Alma gives his son Poirier, that this is what restoration means. Now, this continued to be the way that the restoration of all things was understood in Mormonism until about the Nauvoo period. Initial writings of Joseph Smith, Parley P. Pratt, all talk about the restoration of the world from sin, and that all this would happen at the second coming of Christ. It wasn't a restoration of the gospel. Gradually, though, the restoration of the gospel and of the priesthood of the church started playing into this. First of all, as playing a preparatory role. The sense was, you can't have this restoration of the earth again, and you can't redeem mankind from sin until there's the gospel restored and ordinances are performed for these people. So over time, though, that became the prominent way in which the restoration of all things was viewed. In fact, Joseph Smith went to such an extreme with it, you recall, as he said that even animal sacrifice practiced before the time, since it was practiced before the time of Moses, that would also be restored. Now, today, in common Mormon discourse talks that you hear from the pulpit, generally that's how the restitution or restoration of all things is presented, as a restoration of the gospel, of the priesthood, of the church. Of course, the restoration of animal sacrifice is greatly downplayed, as A lot of explanations have been given as to how that's going to play out, but it's not like the way Joseph Smith saw it, which was temples set up, erected specifically for the ongoing offering of animal sacrifice. So this is an example, again, of how a doctrine, a narrative that we have in Mormonism, we tie it back to Old Testament times and assume that that's the vision that all the prophets had. That's the way it was understood and preached on through the New Testament, on through the time of Joseph Smith, up to the present day. When clearly, if you go back and look at it, examine the records carefully, there was a development, an unfolding of this idea, that different people in different places had different conceptions of these ideas. So let's see, that's just an example anyway. One other insight that I got in doing the research was something I haven't seen anyplace else. It'll be interesting to hear some responses to this. And this has to do with this idea of millennialism that I just mentioned, that in the Old Testament, prophets really talked about an end time state of the earth. And in fact, there's only a single passage in the Bible that talks about a millennium explicitly, and that's in the book of Revelation. And it's no wonder then that most of Christianity, up to the time of the Reformation, they were amillennialists. Most people did not believe in a millennium. Now, there was a concept of postmillennialism that also began to become popular, and that was the idea that Christ would come, judgment would take place, and everything after the millennium took place. And of course, premillennialists had this notion that they got mainly from the book of Revelation, that there would be a resurrection of judgment before the millennium, and that then there would be the 1,000-year period, and then after the millennium there would be another resurrection, another judgment, and so forth. Well, in early Mormonism, it's interesting, if you read through the Book of Mormon, we read it, and the Book of Mormon was to kind of prepare people for the coming of Christ, and yet in the Book of Mormon and in the early Revelations, there really aren't clear descriptions of a second coming preceding a millennial period. You just don't get that sense when you read it, kind of pushing out of your mind the idea of a millennium. You get a distinct impression that this is post-millennialism that is being discussed here, and the same is true in the early Revelations. It isn't until section 29, which came along, I think there were about 30 revelations before that, that there isn't any discussion of the second coming at all. And that's the first time that there is a millennial period suggested. So that was kind of an interesting insight to me, at least, that I hadn't thought about. Aside from that, I do have to say in defense of the picture on the front that it's a nice picture. I say this in defense of Greg Coford's selection, in fact, because this was his desire to have this particular portrait on the front. Anybody know who that is?
Jerome.
It's not me, but Jerome. Yeah, Jerome, Saint Jerome. And but interestingly, he's wearing glasses. Yeah, what's wrong with that? Kind of an appropriate picture for the book, because this is kind of anachronistic. Glasses weren't invented until 900 years after the time of St. Jerome. But a lot of the painters during the Reformation, and I can't remember when this painter lived. Do you remember, Greg? It's in the back.
Yeah, it's in the back, 16 or 1700.
But it was just a popular, common thing that was accepted, that Jerome invented glasses, so he was depicted wearing glasses. But that's how these kinds of ideas sometimes creep into our thought process. Okay, I can see several of you dozing here, nodding, so this is probably an appropriate time to open it up for questions. Yeah.
Wondering if the prophet Joseph Smith's suggestion that there would be a restoration of animal sacrifice, I'm assuming that maybe that's where plural marriage came from as well.
Okay, so the question was more of kind of a
Yeah, I'm
suggestion
I'm
that I'm wondering that
Yeah.
perhaps that could have been related as well to the restoration of plural marriage. And it is interesting that, and this comment's made by a lot of historians, that unlike a lot of restorationists who went back to the New Testament to restore New Testament Christianity, Joseph Smith went all the way back and said, hey, anything is fair game for restoration here, including plural marriage and animal sacrifice. But I don't delve into that, but that's an interesting idea to get into how those might have correlated.
In 1978, when they had the every worthy male pronouncement, one of the justifications for the change was it was never doctrine to ban the blacks from the priesthood. Did you find that in your research?
I have just a couple pages on blacks in the priesthood, and I came basically to the same conclusion, that there's no real solid official pronouncement about it, although it was the teaching at the time. Brigham Young clearly taught it, Orson Hyde taught it, but I know people have gone back and done a lot of research to try to find, the source document for the official pronouncement of it, but it's hard to find. And here's another example of how the church is changing the narrative. This idea of people being more valiant in the pre-existence, that's all Jeff Holland, I guess, a couple years ago, he came out and said, I can't remember the adjective he used, folklore, it's all folklore. It's not really doctrine. And yet, that was what was being taught. That's how Latter-day Saints understood it. Now, one thing I don't get into, by the way, I don't try to split hairs and say, well, that wasn't really ever official doctrine. Because to me, doctrine is just basically the general beliefs and that sort of thing that we have in the church, what is generally taught. And I don't try to split hairs and say, okay, here is what is official doctrine and here's what isn't. In fact, one of the points that I do make is that the church really doesn't have an official theology. And, they have some official pronouncements about things, but you can't go someplace and say, what is the official doctrine of the church on all these matters that I've talked about? Because there isn't any. So I don't know if that evaded your question or not. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I don't understand what doctrine is. It sounds like it could be broad. I mean, could it be so broad as to say that, well, we have a belief that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God? Could that be symbolically and not literal? I mean, does that fit within the realm of doctrine? There really won't be a second coming. There's a doctrine that's a second coming, but it's not going to be literal. It'll be more spiritual. Book of Mormon, it's spiritual. It's not literal. Does that fit within the realm of doctrine? Can doctrine be that broad?
Well, to some people, it is.
Could you believe that? You still think and still be in the community of believers in the
Those are
Latter-day
exactly
Saints?
the questions I raise in the epilogue. Because what you find out is
What
that...
about the answers, though?
Well, you can see certain doctrines where we have done that. I mean, the evolution is the classical, the clear case where all of that is figurative. It's not only just figurative insofar as the man and woman are concerned, but it's figurative all the way through. So we have already adjusted our thinking there and said that's okay to consider all of that as figurative. Well, the logical extension of that is then the fall. Was there really literally a fall? In what sense did Adam fall? It's interesting in the Old Testament, it doesn't say that he introduced death into the world, that he introduced sin into the world. The Jews don't believe that. The Eastern Orthodox faith, they have no notion of that. That's foreign to them. That came from Augustine, primarily. So, and we adopted that sort of doctrine. Are we willing to go back and trace, research the history, look at it, like we did with blacks in the priesthood, and say, well, some of these things maybe don't need to be taken as literally as what we have been accustomed to doing. So, where can you draw the line as to what constitutes faithful membership or whatever, orthodoxy versus heresy? Good question.
Do you see more of the rethinking of the narratives becoming metaphorical in the future?
Well, that's how a lot of it, like the creation account, that has been allegorized. It's not taken literally today. And there's no reason why other things can't be the same way. But what I've done, and the reason why I think this raises a lot of bristles for some people, is because I've said, well, what about all these other situations? What's wrong with saying the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, but perhaps not a literal translation? That's something that's being debated today vigorously, is the literalness of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Other questions?
Did your research indicate to you that these teachings in the Book of Mormon were essentially ideas that were part of the Second Great Awakening that were around Joseph Smith all the time? And I'm thinking about, infant baptism, the nature of God, the discussions between Universalists and
And of course, this is something that Alexander Campbell recognized right off the bat, is that the Book of Mormon answers all the great controversies.
That was the next question. Do you think Alexander Campbell was right?
Was correct. Well, it does. It does answer all the great controversies.
And do you see a big difference between the teachings of Joseph Smith, say, in the Nauvoo period, as opposed to this early, what I call early Mormonism?
Oh, there's definitely a difference. You can see where he went through, like I say, there are several doctrines, like the coming of Elijah, the idea in Hebrews about men becoming perfect, or all people becoming perfect. There's a couple others where he went through 4 or 5 different stages and interpretations of these same passages to support different ideas at different times. One of them that I think is interesting, where in the plurality of gods, where in the book of Revelation, I think it's 1:6, where he said, God has made us all priests or something unto Christ and his God.
Unto God and his Father.
Unto God and his Father, thank you. And that's a little ambiguous, the way it's worded in the King James. Of course, if you look at other passages in King James that are similar to that, it always just means, and his Father is just in the positive for God. But he was really explicit to make sure he put a comma in there and said, unto God, his Father, so that it was clear that this is not talking about God, the Father's Father. But then later, he said, that passage is correct the way it stands, and means literally that God the Father had a father. So, yeah, did Joseph Smith change his views, his teachings, his understanding of the Scriptures, and of even the same Scriptures over time? Clearly he did.
Or his view of the Godhead.
And his views of the God, and his views of doctrine. Yeah. We think that this idea of God the Father having a body of flesh and bones, that was obvious when he walked out of the grove. It was just a given.